two prominent institutional positions completely disappeared from Princess Eugenie's public portfolio in a few short months. In each unique case, the official explanations given to the international media were surprisingly neat, painstakingly constructed, and expertly packaged to be accepted by the public without a closer look at the underlying mechanisms governing modern royal communications. Instead of announcing its arrival with dramatic structural sirens, official palace decrees, or open press conferences, the public is currently witnessing a highly sophisticated masterclass in the quiet, relentless architecture of institutional distancing, an intriguing sociological phenomenon that deliberately and slowly manifests itself through abrupt administrative absences and the frictionless, unacknowledged erasure of public duty. The official biography of Princess Eugenie abruptly and silently vanished from Anti-Slavery International's public website earlier this year, marking the first glaring example of this covert strategic change. In February, a revelation that emerged right after Prince Andrew's recent legal difficulties and the ensuing global media attention reached extremely unsettling heights. The charity, which had previously and quite proudly displayed Princess Eugenie's prominent royal affiliation on its global digital platform, did not make an official public announcement to go along with this digital removal, nor did the executive board of the organization make a kind farewell statement highlighting her years of devoted service. Princess Eugenie did not provide any explanation regarding a change in her philanthropic priorities, and the organization itself remained completely silent. The digital profile just disappeared, turning from an outward sign of high-level royal patronage into a silent digital ghost that left a clear void where a devoted and well-known supporter had once stood. This is a compelling example of how contemporary businesses manage their reputations through abrupt, inexplicable erasure. Astute watchers quickly learned that Princess Eugenie had also quit her highly esteemed and widely reported mentorship role with the King's Foundation 35 on 35 program following this sudden digital departure. A second, equally important development about her institutional capacities that have been publicly sanctioned. In May 2024, she officially joined this carefully chosen project, which was created to encourage, uplift, and support emerging leaders in cutting-edge, highly relevant fields like critical environmental innovation, global sustainability, contemporary architecture, creative design, and organizational representatives gave a very straightforward formal explanation for this second departure, deliberately framing the structural exodus using the precise, unquestionable, and emotionally detached language of corporate governance. The role had logically reached its predetermined structural conclusion without any underlying drama, internal friction, or domestic conflict, as the public was reassured through various media channels that the position was always intended to be strictly temporary in nature, created especially and exclusively to commemorate the King's Foundation's 45th anniversary year. However, when measured by actual events on the ground, the stark optics reveal a completely different and far more complex story than the one presented in the sanitized corporate briefing, because this grand, highly celebrated inclusion into the monarch's flagship philanthropic project resulted in exactly one calendar year of tenure and exactly one publicly documented engagement before the role was quietly and formally terminated. The immaculate surface-level narrative begins to crack under the weight of logical scrutiny and chronological reality at this precise convergence of facts, making the story immensely more complex for those who are prepared to delve below the carefully crafted official press releases. The explanations closely linked to these two simultaneous high-profile departures are serving a very specific, carefully calibrated purpose within the larger invisible strategy of royal reputation management and preventative risk avoidance. This purpose goes far beyond simply explaining successive administrative actions to an interested public. These public relations frameworks are actively influencing how the wider world is expected to understand such events in an effort to permanently put an end to dangerous public speculation before it has a chance to become fully embedded in the cultural discourse. The communication strategy used in the unusual case of Anti-Slavery International is one of total, uncompromising absence. This means that the press is not provided with any explanation at all, allowing the digital disappearance to occur completely in the shadows, with the profound, undeniable silence effectively acting as the final explanation. However, in the closely watched case of the King's Foundation, journalists were promptly given a remarkably clear, orderly music and highly sanitized justification, carefully emphasizing that nothing out of the ordinary, reactive, or undesirable had occurred behind the closed palace gates, that the arrangement was always temporary from its very beginning, and that the institutional timeline was completely predetermined by the calendar. On the surface, both of these institutional explanations, which primarily rely on technical administrative truths to skillfully conceal considerably deeper, far more complex contextual realities concerning the York family's contemporary status within the monarchy, may seem to be entirely factually accurate. However, when both of these significant professional developments occur in the same few months as Prince Andrew's legal troubles, and the subsequent period of intense, inevitable renewed scrutiny surrounding the entire York family, the highly polished defensive nature of those explanations begins to feel much less like natural administrative closure, and much more like careful, deliberate narrative management orchestrated by unseen, highly protective advisors. The primary analytical question here is not whether the logistical, calendar-based explanations for the sudden departures are true in a literal, undeniable sense, but rather whether the incredibly accurate timing of these events is just coincidental, an assumption that seriously calls into question the credibility of even the most understanding independent observer. Anyone who has methodically and analytically followed the slowly evolving, multi-layered and often painful story surrounding the York family over the past several turbulent years will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to responsibly dismiss that lingering question of pure coincidence. Princess Eugenie's sudden resignation from Anti-Slavery International deserves special attention and a detailed structural analysis, given what that specific role represented within the broader, highly personal context of her public life and personal brand identity. This was not merely a ceremonial tie with no real significance, nor was it merely a royal title haphazardly pasted to a charity letterhead for the sake of appearances or maintaining a minimum required quota of philanthropic endeavors. Her public and active involvement in several anti-slavery efforts during the music years was surprisingly deep, notably consistent music, and highly educated. And it became clear to royal analysts that her personal activism outside of the close family shadow was centered around this subject. Rather than being merely a symbolic inherited duty passed down from the vast familial institution, she purposefully focused a significant and highly esteemed portion of her independent public persona around causes directly related to opposing the atrocities of modern slavery and human exploitation. She publicly discussed the horrifying problem with unquestionable genuine conviction and participated in a great deal of intricate philanthropic work related to it. Her involvement in one of the few unique specialized fields inside the well-regulated, meticulously dispersed ecosystem of royal patronages seemed to be very personal, emotionally stirring, and intellectually stimulating. The sudden, unannounced, and completely incomprehensible removal of her profile bears such immense, indisputable weight and requires significantly more scrutiny than a standard administrative update because of this deeply embedded, undeniable personal involvement. She had actively shaped and promoted a highly substantive and meaningful function over a significant period of time, and she was emotionally committed in it. It was not only the loss of a decorative peripheral board position. The stunning speed at which the departure occurred is even more significant than the departure itself, since it occurred nearly immediately following the shift in the external news cycle. Because neither a gradual, courteous transition time nor a long-term, transparent restructuring process inside the charity's governance structure led to the institutional shift. Rather, it occurred swiftly, discreetly, and decisively, almost immediately following her father's grave legal problems, which inevitably and abruptly returned to the intense international media spotlight. That unprecedented reactionary speed strongly suggests a sudden moment of critical, high-stakes evaluation, whether it was Princess Eugenie herself making a painful sacrifice, her private communication advisors playing fierce defense, the charity's executive board defending its admirable mission, or most likely a coordinated combination of all three entities. It demonstrates unequivocally that a key player in the intricate decision-making matrix carefully examined the quickly shifting external conditions and brutally concluded that upholding the highly visible public connection had suddenly become completely too difficult or possibly far too dangerous for the organization's crucial reputation. The final decision was taken covertly and the reputational calculation was finished quickly. The profile just vanished into thin air, leaving no digital trace. Because it is firmly and formally situated within King Charles's own direct institutional framework and immediate area of influence, the King's foundation position, on the other hand, has a very different but no less profound and illuminating significance overall. This is one of the monarch's most significant projects, bearing his royal name prominently, reflecting his long-standing personal interests, and serving as an undeniable cornerstone of his long-term historical legacy as a champion of the built environment. It is by no means an independent third-party non-profit that operates entirely outside the bounds of strict royal supervision. When Princess Eugenie was initially appointed to this prestigious mentoring program in May 2024, it was widely reported in various media and portrayed to the British public as a highly significant, deeply structural link between the increasingly marginalised York branch of the family and one of Charles's most fundamentally significant charitable endeavours. In spite of the intense, seemingly radioactive controversy surrounding her father, Eugenie had successfully and securely maintained a functional, respected place within the larger operational royal ecosystem, according to a reassuring narrative that was strongly and purposefully implied at the exact moment of its hopeful announcement. Despite the initial flurry of publicity and structural validation, the position was only in place for a year. Surprisingly, it produced only one publicly documented engagement that could be presented as tangible evidence of labor before it abruptly ended with no indication of future involvement, lateral movement within the organization, or prospects for replacement within the vast foundation. Any genuine, impartial observer of royal dynamics and palace politics would find it very difficult to overlook or minimize the glaring, undeniable contrast between May's joyful acceptance and her swift, silent dismissal a year later. The carefully constructed, legally approved language used to describe and frame the departure for general public consumption makes this particular case both fascinating and instructive. In the ensuing media coverage, palace briefings were extremely cautious, almost aggressively so, in stressing that Eugenie had not, under any circumstances, been fired, removed, or abandoned from the initiative. Instead, they emphasized repeatedly, using the same repetitive language in various media outlets, that the position had simply ended as it was intended to from the start. In the incredibly intricate, meticulously regulated, and utterly cruel world of royal communications, little semantic distinctions like these are vital because they comprise the primary underlying currency of institutional reputation. Being labeled dropped suggests a severe, humiliating rejection, clearly implying that someone in a position of ultimate power music made the deliberate choice to purposefully create instant distance because of a perceived failure, an obvious liability, or a breach of trust. Conversely, a role that music is joyfully shown as finishing organically suggests a solid organizational structure, harmonious future planning, and a very cordial interaction between all significant parties. Because communication teams made such a concerted, cohesive, and visible effort to forcefully highlight that specific linguistic distinction, it is clear that alternative, considerably more damaging interpretations were already actively spreading among the skeptical press and the curious public. In the complicated world of institutional public relations, anticipatory defensive explanations are rarely offered with such coordinated vigor unless there is a keen, uncomfortable awareness of a bad perception that needs to be remedied immediately. The explanation is due to the fact that astute observers were already voicing uncomfortable and perfectly reasonable concerns about whether something else was happening behind the heavily guarded scenes. Given the undeniable overall context of the situation, a suspiciously brief one-year role, a single public engagement to justify the title, and a constant suffocating backdrop of unrelenting family controversy, that extremely skeptical interpretation becomes not only entirely understandable, but also entirely logical and practically inevitable. When the independent charity's total silence and the Royal Foundation's hyperactive spin are examined together, a much larger, indisputable pattern of institutional distancing that is purposefully and carefully developed almost imperceptibly to the average person emerges. In this particular contemporary type of royal exile, there are no official letters of criticism published in the Gazette, no contentious public evaluations, and no grandiose theatrical declarations of permanent separation. In public, the inflexible facade demands that everything remain perfectly comfortable, steadfastly supportive, and totally cohesive in the face of adversity. Official palace statements about Eugenie's current pregnancy are overwhelmingly positive, ensuring that the public sees a loving family enjoying a new baby rather than a dysfunctional institution. High-profile family appearances at religious services and national events proceed according to schedule, giving the cameras a consistent, unified image. Reports state that she continues to receive coveted invitations to significant private and semi-public family gatherings, ensuring her safe and secure integration into the family. Additionally, King Charles is purposefully and consistently shown in authorized anonymous background briefings as being completely delighted by the positive improvements in her family and personal life. But beyond that painstakingly maintained impenetrable facade of interpersonal friendliness, the tangible formal structural linkages that physically linked Eugenie to the actual working machinery of royal-related institutions appear to be silently, systematically, and ruthlessly disappearing one by one. The deeply personal anti-slavery role has completely disappeared, permanently erased from the digital record as if it never occurred. As a brief anniversary experiment, the much-discussed mentorship position with the King's Foundation has officially terminated and been neatly packed away. Crucially, the dates of both of these significant institutional events exactly coincide with the undeniable increase in global media coverage of Prince Andrew's lasting ties and legal vulnerabilities. The overwhelmingly optimistic and relentlessly optimistic public rhetoric seems to be specifically designed to avoid confronting this inevitably painful question, which is whether the unwavering, well-publicized support that is being so conspicuously displayed is a true reflection of the reality that exists behind palace walls, or if it is merely one polished superficial layer that conceals a much more complex and brutal internal picture of strategic institutional survival. The York sisters now appear to have a particularly complicated, almost contradictory place within the tight hierarchy of the contemporary royal family, according to royal author Andrew Lowe's perceptive earlier observation, which adds yet another fascinating, extremely intricate facet to this ongoing issue. They are securely and pleasantly ensnared in the crossfire of starkly opposed viewpoints over their ultimate future role within the disintegrating organization. Because some seasoned, well-connected observers fully feel that King Charles still genuinely loves his nieces on a purely paternal level and would naturally want to maintain close, highly prominent contacts with them despite their father's tremendous disastrous flaws. However, some trustworthy sources make it abundantly evident that Prince William and Catherine are much more circumspect, reflecting a modernized, fiercely protective and unsentimental approach to the monarchy, particularly when there are direct concerns about the institution's reputation, long-term viability, and ideal public perception. We may be witnessing more than simply King Charles making straightforward unilateral administrative decisions about Eugenie's future engagement based on foundation demands, if that brutally realistic portrayal of internal division is correct. Instead, we may be seeing the definitely growing effects of a far broader internal power shift in which future leaders are firmly but quietly setting their boundaries and intentionally lowering future risks. The King's Foundation role may have ended quite neatly and conveniently on paper, but any strategic decisions about growing it, creating a permanent successor role, or actively boosting Eugenie's structural involvement would undoubtedly require high-level discussions involving much more than just familial sentiment or uncle-to-niece affection. So far, those complex internal conversations appear to be consistently producing the same cautious, highly protective reaction when taking into account the undeniable evidence of her rapidly disappearing affinities, which is not yet and possibly never. Eugenie is actively managing this silent, excruciating institutional retreat while also preparing for the much-anticipated arrival of her third child. She is reportedly expecting a child later this year, which will require her to carefully manage both her complex, shifting public persona and her demanding family life in a home that is already frequently described in the media as being too crowded for a rapidly growing family. The politically charged issues surrounding royal housing arrangements, taxpayer subsidies, and property allocations, which continue to attract intense attention and severe scrutiny from both public watchdog bodies and vocal political observers, make her already precarious position even more stressful and vulnerable. Meanwhile, despite the undeniable collapse of her institutional portfolio, she skillfully maintains a well-managed public image that is consistently optimistic, clearly positive, and entirely forward-looking. Through her well-planned public appearances, extensively documented social events, commemorated family milestones, and evident preparations for a new baby, she conveys an overwhelming, unbroken sense of marital stability and personal contentment. However, in concert with her flawless, impenetrable personal image, the formal structural frameworks that connect her to important royal institutional action appear to be progressively, unquestionably disappearing into nothingness. Both of these seemingly incompatible realities coexist within the harsh royal ecology, music, as the apparent warmth between people is probably quite real based on shared history and long-standing familial ties, but it is also clear that her formal affiliations have gradually decreased, an outcome based on cold, calculating institutional survival. How our modern, widely observed monarchy essentially maintains its reputation, calculates its liabilities, and mercilessly cuts its risk in the harsh 21st century is maybe the biggest and most important lesson to be learnt from this entire ongoing narrative. Because lasting ancient institutions never, if at all, publicly announce to the world that they are actively and purposefully distancing themselves from a member, preferring to let administrative decisions and silent erasures handle the heavy lifting of institutional preservation. For those who keep a careful eye on the monarchy, the real tale is never found in the headlines, but rather in the places where history formerly existed, inscribed in the subdued deeds of a system that puts its own survival first. If you want to continue following how these contemporary organizations manage their public narratives behind closed palace gates, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments section whether you think this is an unfortunate series of coincidences or a planned strategy for long-term institutional survival.